Happy Friday, everybody. Couple days delayed. Work and school activities have certainly predominated, but wanted to get everyone caught up on sort of the agenda items and sort of the body of work that had occurred at the regular City of Pauls Valley City Council meeting on August 26th and PVMA, Municipal Authority. So I'll kind of go through the agenda items and sort of my thoughts and what happened and what we did. And so we basically approved the consent agenda, which we've talked about before, is basically the minutes of meetings of various boards and committees associated with it. We approved purchase orders to the tune of $300,982.76, and I'd sort of review those. And I'll discuss that in some of the financial items. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We actually approved the financials as well, but looking through the financials, and I looked through both the PVMA and the city government financials on a monthly basis when they come out. I look at the PO orders. A lot of times I like to go in and talk to Joe prior to the meeting to sort of get a feel for why things are a certain way, what was this expenditure, and to basically have an understanding of, where we have budget overages. And so if you look at like general government, revenue for July for the city of Pauls Valley was at $780,729. Expense side, $898,642 for a difference of about $118,000. So another budget shortfall. And so with the budget shortfalls, I mean, you look at where we are in sales tax revenue, we were actually up by about 28,000 over prior year and even the prior month. And so sales tax revenues are actually trending in positive ways for the fiscal year. However, just like everything else, the cost of items, whether it's fuel for fleet vehicles, whether it's parts for things, whether it's the inflationary expense of SWB and benefits, all of that stuff sort of has a toll. And so when I look at the budget line items, for each of the things that are sort of budgeted for each of the departments, I think in the range of 8%, right? And on a monthly basis, if you were to eat up the entire budgetary line item for any one department, you're using about 8% of that budget on a monthly basis over 12 months. And so anything that's over 8%, I sort of, ask about, have questions on. Some things that jumped out to me this most recent month in July for the financials that were finished. We had an overage of chemicals to $23,000 for the aquatic park, but in talking to Joe, that's pretty standard, relevant to the season. It kind of makes me wonder if they're stocking up and you can purchase things a little bit cheaper at the end of the season. That transaction in regards to chemicals totaled about 67% of the overall budget for the year. But again, we're getting toward the end of the year, and my guess is potentially chemicals are a little bit cheaper, so maybe we're buying in bulk. That's a question I want to kind of ask. We had some audit expenses. Currently we don't have a city clerk, and so the outfit that does our audits for the city also has the ability to perform the clerk services, and so we're paying for that currently. Currently is cheaper than actually having a clerk, and so there's a whole bunch of conversation we can have on having a clerk, the qualifications of a clerk, having that job posted, the costs that they're in associated, but we're actually having some cost savings currently based upon what we're currently doing. One thing that I've sort of noticed too is, there's a lot of quality of life things in the expense line items. Things like, the water park, generated, so much revenue in July. Did it outpace $89,000 in expense? And do we need to look at, and I mentioned this in prior podcasts and lives, do we need to increase costs or fees for people to come in? So I think, maybe talking with Robert to say, hey, is this what we've considered? Because again, most of the folks that come there, I think, there are people from Pauls Valley that utilize it, but a lot of folks from external use it. And again, you may lose money on it, but there's sales tax revenue associated with that potentially. There was an additional overage in regard to uniforms for the police department to the tune of $13,000, which is a pretty large allocation, as we only had $35,000 allocated for the year. But in talking with Joe, we hired 2 new policemen, replacements for those that had left, and outfitting them with all the gear that they need. It has a cost. I mean, you can kind of imagine that with all the specialty equipment they have. And I did ask about the recycling of certain equipment and uniforms, and I think that they do that as much as they can. But I just would want us to be frugal on all the things we're looking at. I mean, keep people safe, have utilizing equipment, but it's one of those things that kind of jumps out at you from that perspective. And so basically our overall expense for the month, we're talking about 8% per month over 12 months, gets you that 100% for any budget, even the overall budget for the city. So the overall general expense for general government in July was at 9.63 versus the 8. So 1.63 over budget and expense totaled $118,000 overage. So again, there may be reasonable time in another podcast or live to talk about long-term reserve and how monies flow there, and there's a good flow chart that we can use for something like that. So that may be a separate live that we'll do. When you look at, and we'll talk about municipal authority when we get into it, but we approve the financials consistent with what we sort of talked about there. There was one identification from Amy Ritchie of some credit card fees that she'd sort of seen, and some corrections and pass-throughs that we need to sort of do, but nothing of significance. And so moving down the agenda, we approved the financial statements, as I said. We had consideration of two separate tort claims. One was in regards to a limb being down and affecting a shed. The other one was in regards to potential damages due to a pothole on a road in Pauls Valley. And so OMAG is sort of the insurance liability and insurance arm for the city. And so OMAG, looking at that, recommended denying the claim or the consideration of the tort claim based on their review. And in the case of the limb, my understanding, and this is what Joe said, that the debris was picked up and the item was addressed. And then in regards to the damage to a car, an investigation demonstrated that the area where the pothole was not directly on the roadway, and to get to it would be out of the ordinary. Again, that's just sort of what we've been informed. And so both of those tort claims were denied based upon recommendations from OMAG, OMAG. There was discussion about, looking at surplus sort of properties that the city owns. Over the years, the city has sort of acquired, different properties through different means that we're really not doing anything with. There's things that we have to maintain relevant to expense. And so Joe was thinking, it's probably a good idea. We've done this with some fleet vehicles and equipment with the city a few months ago. And so looking at some of the city properties that we have, and so doing appraisals, evaluation, and identification of property as surplus with potential sale. Again, all that would have to come back to the council, but we approved a motion for that to occur. In addition, there are certain lease sort of agreements that have gone on through the city on certain city properties, handshake agreements, verbal agreements, where people are utilizing land for different purposes, and we want to get those under official sort of documentation. And so that was considered and approved for Joe to move forward with that. Previously, in another city council meeting, we talked about an OMAG body camera grant program for the police. And so we approved a quote from Halo's body cameras using that grant. So it didn't cost the city anything, but it was a grant for $10,000 for body cameras being worn by Pauls Valley PD. In the future, there would be a potential fee on a per camera annual subscription or monthly subscription, fairly affordable. But the grant made these things sort of possible. So that quote for the grant to be used to pay for those things was approved by the city. The next line item was in regards to adjusting an ordinance for the city of Pauls Valley to basically allow tiny homes to come into the city. And so this had gone to planning and zoning where it had been vetted. The language had been worked on with the assistant city manager, Mark Norman. And I was there for that meeting at planning and zoning a few weeks ago. That information had come back to them, and then this is coming forward to us. And so basically saying, a tiny home is 400 square feet or less. And currently the way the ordinance will read is that you can basically have a tiny home like that put in a lot that would be appropriate to the setbacks and the boundaries that are established as a certain percentage. So you can't put a tiny home on a lot that a regular size home would fit on based on zoning and ordinance. However, if the lot meets the specifications for a tiny home to be put there, it can be. And so that was approved. A motion for that was approved, and we'll monitor how that kind of goes. I think there's definitely a need for affordable housing in Pauls Valley, need for a lot of different housing in Pauls Valley, but that was approved. There was an executive session that we went into, and there was no action from the executive session. I'm thinking if Joe had any comments. I'm going to kind of look through my notes. He discussed the grant approval to the tune of $11 million for the airport that we previously discussed in a prior meeting. Our match on that's like 2.5%. So you get an $11 million grant to fix the runways with $293,000 in payout on a match from the city. That's done over a 2-year period. And this was budgeted for and worked on in collaboration with Mr. Carson out there who manages the airport. There was a beautification award that would go towards Samaritan and some other items he kind of updated us on. And then additionally, there was a letter. I think this was actually in PVMA. So that was about all he had sort of listed there. There were no additional attorney or counsel comments beyond that, and we adjourned that meeting. Next, we moved into Pauls Valley Municipal Authority, which is like our utility arm of the city, and we're trustees for through council. We approved the consent agenda, which basically was the previous minutes for last PVMA meeting, which was on August 12th. And we approved purchase orders to the tune of $123,000. Some overages that I sort of saw for July existed at 12% with chemicals and 15.6% with supplies. Some of the things that we obviously were going through in the summer with the water situation and wastewater, even to have an increase in chemical and supply costs is certainly expected. So that wasn't a surprise, but certainly above the 8%. There were some landfill costs that were a slight bit elevated, 11%, and some insurance costs at 14%. But I know that, based on some of the things we've had to do, we've hired some folks at the water plant and water distribution with pipes and whatnot, and had some things go on at wastewater as well. And so I think some of those insurance costs are born from that. So the financial statements were basically approved. Overall revenue for the city on water, trash, and wastewater was $569,000. However, overall expenses with the repairs and things going on calibrated to $586,000, so an actual loss of about $18,000. Obviously, we've been talking about utility rates for water. I think that discussion will continue to occur, particularly once we get the engineering report back from DEQ. So we'll wait and see what happens there. But the financial report was approved in that way. And then, and like we were talking about surplus property there and leases in general government, there are also properties that PVMA owns, as well as things that are leased out near Longmire, property we own. And so working on identifying land that could be sold or appropriate lease for those that are utilizing properties near there that are generating a profit on their own. So, and we approved a motion for him to look at those situations. And again, nothing would occur without coming before council for a vote. A letter that was sent from Elmore City Rural Water Corporation, basically a request to adjust the water bill for July. I want to say their normal utilization was about 4 million gallons. I think they used 6. They cited, the flushing of sort of the water lines and stuff based upon some of the water that everyone very keenly aware of. And so some of the discussion that we sort of had was, DEQ was saying the water was safe. Now, was it brown? Yes. And we don't need to litigate that whole situation again. However, we didn't rebate the citizens of Pauls Valley or anyone else. And we felt like, although we didn't like the color of the water and understand where they're coming from and what they were doing from that perspective, but no adjustment, we declined any kind of adjustment in that regard. Just because we didn't do it for the city, we didn't do it for any of the other rural water districts we supply water to. And obviously the water's operating pretty well now. And so from that perspective, didn't want to set a precedent for those sorts of things, essentially. But certainly understand where people are coming from, and it's certainly appropriate to ask. Looking at the remainder, I don't think there was really anything else. That was the last bit of it. We closed out PVMA, and then the evening was done. And so that was essentially the meeting from 8/26 on Tuesday. I don't believe we're going to have a meeting in The first or the second Tuesday in September, due to OML, Oklahoma Municipal League weekly conference. Joe will be at that, and I know maybe some other council members will be at that. And so there won't be a meeting then, but there will be a meeting on the 23rd of September, so be looking for that. I'll send out the agenda items for it at that time. And it is Friday night, so there's obviously Fifth Friday Art Walk downtown going on. Lots of really cool things being done by the Arts Council, so go check that out. Football at Wacker Park at 7:30. Definitely go check that out. And so a lot of activity for Friday night. So I hope everyone is enjoying their evening, afternoon, and has a really, really great weekend. It's a 3-day weekend. Be safe through Monday, and we'll see you guys all very soon. Okay, talk soon.